Good afternoon, and welcome back to the ORWH 30th Anniversary Scientific Symposium afternoon session. My name is Lisa Begg, and I'm the program official for the Birch program, which had its 20th anniversary celebration yesterday. And I've been asked to cover a few slides from yesterday and introduce the panel today because all of them have a Birch affiliation. In terms of yesterday, there were two major addresses, one in honor of Dr. Ruth L. Kirstein, her memorial lectureship, which was given by Dr. Patricia Molino. Dr. Molino is a leading mentor and renowned researcher with continuous NIH funding over 20 years. And she is also has an endowed chair and is department chair at Louisiana State University in New Orleans. Her talk, as well as the other talks, are available on the LabRoots platform from yesterday, as well as the NIH videocast archive. The second major address was given by Dr. Claire Stirk, who gave the inaugural Birch Legacy of Leadership lecture. Dr. Stirk is the president emerita from Emory University, and also created the Emory Birch program 6 years ago, just as she was assuming her presidency of Emory. So a busy lady. She covered mentoring as well as her various career achievements and different pathways for young investigators to consider. In terms of the Birch program, some of you may not be familiar with it, so I've been asked to give you just a few brief slides. The Birch program, Birch stands for Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health. It was created in 2000, so it's had its 20th anniversary yesterday. It is considered an NIH, a mentored career development institutional grant, which means it trains more than one trainee each at any one time. And it focuses in on the health of women and sex and gender influences. A program was established in 2000, and it partners across the NIH, and there's a subsequent slide which lists our IC partners. From the onset, it focused in on interdisciplinary mentoring. At the time, this was very unusual, and we have continued the focus here, and are very proud to say that we, as you can see here, have had representation either as the grantee institution or the school within the grantee institution, and training scholars in these areas of medicine, nursing, public health, social sciences, bioengineering, behavioral sciences, anthropology, and so forth, as they relate to research on the health of women. In terms of accomplishments, this slide actually represents a summary of the research evaluation that was done between 2000 and 2018. There were 88 grants to 44 institutions during that period of time. And as you can see here on the left, these are the institutes and centers at NIH that have partnered with us over the 20-year period, including the Office of AIDS Research. At present, we have 22 active Birch programs. And if I was able to show you a map, they would represent across the United States, Eastern, Southern, Midwest, and the Western states as well. So we're very proud of that. The program is funded at approximately $10 million a year, and the institutes and centers are contributing funding as well as the ORWH being the majority. And on the right side, you will see that the current recipients are the 22 institutions on the right side. The Birch evaluation program was undertaken in the run-up for the 20th anniversary, and I would like to acknowledge my two colleagues, Dr. Zinnia Tigno and Dr. Sharice Johnstone, who have worked on the evaluation report. In terms of outcomes, 84% of our scholars during that 18-year period stayed in academia, largely in women's health research, and another 15% were in industry, and a very small amount went into government. Terminal degrees, we are very interested in this, as is NIH, because of the interest in training not only Ph.D. level scientists, but physician scientists. As you can see here, about 42% of the Birch Scholars have an MD or a combination MD, Ph.D., MD, M.P.H, and so forth. And 54% have Ph.D. And some of those also have additional degrees. And you'll see also the male to female ratios here. 80% of the Birch Scholars are women over the 20-year period, 20% are men. We're very pleased about recruiting men as well. In terms of productivity, we were gratified to find here that R-level grants, and these would be R01 grants, the classic R01 grants, R21, which is a small grant innovation grant, and then R03, which is another small grant mechanism. So 70% of the Birch Scholars have had at least one R-level grant post their Birch training. And you can see the range goes up more than 10, and many of those with the higher numbers of grants were part of very successful interdisciplinary teams. So there was a synergy there, which increased the number of grants as well. There was 30% of the scholars went on to achieve individual K grants, and these are career development grants. And then 77% of the scholars received, in addition to the R-level NIH grants, they received foundation grants, institutional seed money grants, and so forth. So again, this is a highly productive group of scholars, and now number over 700. We were also very pleased, and this is a relatively new the phenomena here, is that when the program was created in 2000, it was not focused on recruiting underrepresented minorities. But in the more recent years we have, and as you can see here, 21% of the scholars recruited between 2015 and 2018 fall under the underrepresented minority category. And that's the NIH definition that includes African American or Black, Pacific Islander, the Alaska Native American Indian, as well as Hispanic or Latina. So we're pleased with this as well. There were some of the scholars who declined to give their race and ethnicity, and that, of course, we accept that in terms of any research. In terms of the general preliminary conclusions, as you can see here, there's career success, there's beneficial relationships, and then the women's health research. In addition to the grant, securing R-level grants and foundation grants, the scholar group was also highly productive in terms of their number of publications, and we're actually continuing to research that in terms of impact. In terms of mutual beneficial relationships, it was the principal investigators, the mentors, the mentees, all working together to benefit one another. And one of the interesting findings we found as well, because we interviewed the mentors felt that they benefited from their mentees in terms of looking at research in a different way, in a different angle. So we were very pleased about that. In terms of institutional and broader aspects, the principal investigators and others documented that the visibility of the Birch program within their home institutions helped them advance women's health research and sex and gender research as well, and also allowed them to leverage for new courses, for other grants, and so forth. So there was sort of a multiplicative effect of the Birch program being at their institution. And it now brings me to, with great pleasure, to introduce the moderator for this sex and gender, sex as a biological variable panel, Judith Regensteiner. Dr. Regensteiner is one of the Birch PIs, and has been a long-term supporter and innovator in terms of women's health research and sex as a biological variable, SABV. As you can see here, she holds a professorship of medicine in the Division of General Internal Medicine and Cardiology at the University of Colorado. She also has an endowed chair, the Judith and Joseph Wagner Endowed Chair in Women's Health. She's director, in fact, she created the Center for Women's Health Research at the university. She leads an interdisciplinary team, having a little trouble here. There we go.
Beg. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I want to thank Drs. Clayton, Begg, and Dutard and the Office of Research in Women's Health. I am honored to be moderating this important panel, Sex as a Biological Variable. We will have three excellent panelists speaking today, Drs. Virginia Miller, Karen Freund, and Kedir Turi. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then their talks will follow. After the three talks, we will have a question and answer period. Our first presentation will be from Dr. Virginia Miller, the Professor Emeritus of Surgery and Physiology at the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Miller's research has included work with experimental animals and clinical studies focused on how sex steroids and conditions unique to women, that is pregnancy and menopause, affect cardiovascular health and cognition. Dr. Miller has also played a key role in innovative curriculum development on the topic of sex as a biological variable, and this has made a difference in the field. She has served as the principal investigator of the Mayo Clinic Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health, the BIRCH program, and of the Mayo Clinic Specialized Center of Research Excellence on Sex Differences, the SCORE grant, as well as director of the Mayo Clinic Women's Health Research Center from 2010 to 2020. She has authored over 250 original publications and reviews. Her awards include the Bernadine Healy Award for Visionary Leadership in Women's Health, Women's Day Magazine Red Dress Award, the Paul M. Van Houte Distinguished Lectureship in Vascular Pharmacology, and the Walter B. Cannon Award from the American Physiological Society. Our second panelist will be Dr. Karen Freund. Dr. Freund is the Sarah Murray Jordan Professor of Medicine at the Tufts University School of Medicine and a Vice Chair in the Department of Medicine at Tufts Medical Center. She also holds a Harry and Elsa Giler American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professorship. She serves as co-principal investigator of the Tufts BIRCH program and has received local and national awards for her work on career development, especially for women and underrepresented women scientists. Her research career has focused on women's health, with much of her work specifically focused on health disparities in women. She's internationally recognized for her work in patient navigation to reduce disparities and on the impact of insurance reform on care. Her research portfolio includes work funded through the Office of Research on Women's Health to examine the factors associated with the lack of career progression of women, especially women from underrepresented populations, and specifically in biomedical careers. She and her colleagues have conducted the only national longitudinal study of medical school faculty in this regard, and this work has demonstrated that women continue to lag behind men in career advancement and leadership, even accounting for their academic achievements. And she has outlined specific institutional interventions which may reverse these inequities. Our final panelist will be Dr. Kedir Turi. Dr. Turi joined Vanderbilt University as a T32 supported postdoctoral fellow in 2015. He transitioned to a BIRCH scholar, and we are very proud of our BIRCH scholars, those of us who are BIRCH PIs, in 2018. As a BIRCH scholar, he was among 3 scholars selected for oral presentation at the National BIRCH meeting last year, and he did an elegant and eloquent talk about his work. His research focus is on identifying and understanding phenotypes and endotypes of childhood asthma and allergic diseases using a multi-omics platform. He integrates infants and children's immune responses and metabolomes to understand asthma and allergic disease development, including the origin of sex differences in allergic diseases. He was recently awarded a K01 mentored training grant, so he's achieved his own individual K award, which is often the next step of a successful BIRCH scholar, and will pursue his goal of becoming an independent investigator. Welcome, Drs. Miller, Freund, and Turi.
Thank you, Dr. Regensteiner, for that introduction and for inviting me to work with you on this important panel today. Also, thanks to the Office of Research on Women's Health for putting on this celebration to highlight all their achievements over the last 30 years. Here are my disclosures. And during the short time I have with you today, I'd like to cover 3 important topics. First of all, I'd like to review for you or lay the foundation for inclusion of sex as a biological variable in research. I'd like to differentiate sex from gender in translational research. And finally, I'd like to identify barriers and strategies for continued success. So what is the foundation? The foundation is that a sex-based approach to research is really the driver for developing a holistic approach to patient-centered care. And why is that? Well, just to remind everybody that every nucleated mammalian cell in the human body, that includes us, has a sex. That is, it contains a group of sex chromosomes, the XX for female and the XY for male. And although there may be some variation in these in these chromosomes, we know that the presence of them in the nucleus really directs gene transcription and translation, which affects cell functions independent of any hormones that might be present. This is a genomic effect, and it is a sex-specific effect. However, these sex chromosomes, in addition to influencing functions of the autosomes, also direct development of the sex organs, which are important for the production of sex-specific hormones, primarily testosterone for males, which is then aromatized to an estrogen in both males and females. But estrogen, of course, predominates in females. And these hormones can diffuse into the cell to bind to cellular receptors, which affect, again, nuclear transcription. But they also can bind to surface receptors where their activity affects ion channels, surface receptors which initiate cell signaling mechanisms, which then may indirectly affect genetic effects. But the ion channels and the surface receptors, which do not initiate direct genomic reaction, are called the genomic regulation of the sex hormones. Because of these sex hormones and sex genes, the chromosomes in every cell of the body, you can understand that sex is a basic biological variable affecting all systems of the body and is the basis for individualized medicine. Because there are sex-specific chromosomes and hormones then, there are sex differences in incidence, prevalence, etiology, symptomatology, response to treatment, morbidity, and mortality from disease. But these aren't the only factors which influence health and disease. The biological factors, being male or female, of course, are dictated by the genetics, the sex chromosomes and race, of course, age and hormonal status, which will vary across the age, and reproductive history are biological factors which affect health and disease. But we must also consider the psychosocial factors, which can indirectly influence by the biological factors. These are factors which are considered as components of gender and include things like where you live, the geographical location, the environmental exposures. For example, if you are exposed to certain levels of oxygen in the air. Dr. Regensteiner is at high altitude. I'm practically at sea level here in Minnesota. Cultural expectations of how we behave and restrictions in terms of what we might be exposed to. Family relationships, which might influence our level of stress. Education, which might influence our income, availability of healthcare, and of course our lifestyle, whether we are active, what foods we eat, whether we use recreational drugs or alcohol, smoking, and so on, all can affect disease. Therefore, we have to consider the interaction between the psychosocial factors and biological factors by accounting for these individual or each of these psychosocial factors to know where to intervene to improve health. So once we have made these basic discoveries, we must incorporate those concepts of the discovery into a curriculum. But to do so, we must consider the components of such a curriculum. First of all, we must include the basic definitions of sex and gender. We have to review the control of the sex chromosomes, the hormonal effects on cellular activities, interactions of hormonal activities with pharmaceutical or metabolic components of drugs for drug hormone interactions. We need to include sex differences in how we assess our study designs and statistical analyses, expression of sex differences in health and disease on a population level, the intersection of environmental and psychosocial factors with biological factors, and how these influence health disparities. And actually, there's ethical implications of the how healthcare might be delivered. And of course, right now, there's a lot of discussion around these issues in terms of the COVID vaccine, how that might be distributed. And we don't hear a lot about sex differences. We hear a lot about racial differences and sociological factors of where individuals might be living or their age. Sex, though, must be included in that discussion somewhere along the line. Once we have these concepts embedded into curriculum, we must develop guidelines for how they're actually going to be implemented in clinical practice or research activities. And then to disseminate this information into real-world situations. And finally, as I mentioned before, public health decisions and the global applications of sex and gender through public health integration. Although we have achieved some success in these areas, we still face three major barriers. The first is resources, the second is training, and the third is shifting agendas and political pressures. But let's look at some of the strategies that have been implemented by the Office of Research on Women's Health to overcome these barriers. First of all, resources. In 1991, Bernadine Healy was appointed as the first woman director of the National Institutes of Health, and she developed some targeted funding for investigation into the effects of estrogen on coronary artery disease. I was fortunate to receive one of 6 applications that were successful for this initiative, and this really launched my career into a study of hormones and sex-specific effects of hormones on the cardiovascular system. And as a consequence of that small RFA, or request for applications, there was a plethora of other studies that weren't funded through that initiative that continued to move through NIH study sections and really brought about an explosion of information about how hormones affect cellular function during the 1990s. Right now, there are supplements to apply for researchers to apply for to include both males and female animals, or enrich their populations of patients with men or women to achieve an understanding to be able to assess how sex influences a particular area of study. In terms of training, there have been several successful initiatives. One is the Specialized Center of Research on Sex Differences, now the Specialized Centers of Research Excellence on Sex Differences, which contains an educational or career enhancement component. Together with that and the Building Interdisciplinary Careers in Women's Health, which is a competitive program initiated by the Office of Research on Women's Health to support junior investigators in the areas of women's health, will ensure that there are investigators competent to study sex differences going forward, and also that the field will flourish and expand. Recently, the office has initiated or developed some educational modules which are free on the internet, which can be used in a variety of educational modalities in classroom, private study, group discussion, and so on, to really enhance what we know in a broader sense of scientists, physicians, and even the general public, and how sex influences health and disease. In terms of shifting agendas and political pressures, We all know from our own experiences that even at our own institutions, the agendas may change in terms of curriculum, access to materials, how things are delivered, but we must remain vigilant in terms of pushing the idea that sex is a basic biological component at the fundamental levels of health and disease. This not only has to happen at the educational levels, but also in the research initiatives. Having these initiatives that we've already started, we have to make sure that they are sustained. And sometimes that requires repeat visits to deans, repeat visits to curriculum managers, and educational partnerships with individuals actually developing or delivering the course material. We must continue to partner with journal editors to assure that research that research results are published for each individual sex. Even if the study is not powered to do a sex-specific analysis, having the raw data available enables those data to be used in meta-analysis, and of course increases transparency, which would allow for the development of new hypotheses in the future. We have to continue to educate the public on the importance of understanding sex as a biological variable, and really the difference between sex and gender in terms of, and their interaction in terms of the influence on health and disease. Finally, we have to continue to work with lawmakers in terms of their understanding. I think the general public, of course, but they are in a higher position to really influence what we do in terms of funding initiatives or actually application of the data that might be available. We have to include them in a huge educational effort so that they understand that sex is fundamental to biology and research in the future. So over the past 30 years, the Office of Research of Women's Health has been successful in a variety of initiatives. I congratulate them on these efforts and wish them success as they move forward in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will have questions during the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Judy. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and I'm very excited to be talking about mentoring as a way to address sex as a biologic variable in biomedical research. So why do I want to focus today on mentorship as a way of ensuring that junior faculty are including sex differences in their approaches? Well, I think this is really critical, especially at the stage of our early stage investigators. I think if they learn the methods and the reasoning behind including sex differences in their research at their early stages of their careers, it's not only going to improve their research, but it's going to give them the skills for their future studies. I think it will also serve as they become the mentors of the future to reinforce looking at sex differences in all research. There are three aspects of mentorship that I really want to consider in our discussions today, and hopefully in our discussion period after these presentations. One is the role of group and peer mentorship when thinking about sex differences. The second is the role of the individual mentorship or the individual mentors on the scholars mentoring team. And then the third is specifically thinking about the biostatistical mentorship. I'm going to end with some thoughts about how we can move this forward, especially how we train our mentors in order to have the skill set to do this as part of their mentorship. So starting with group or peer mentorship. So most of our organizations have some types of career development programs for our Birch scholars. And oftentimes these are joint programs along with other K awardees within our organizations or other junior faculty who are aspiring to develop K applications. I think this is really a great opportunity to introduce the notion of sex as a biologic variable to a broad audience of investigators who may have never really considered it in their research. It's a chance to really describe and discuss with that audience the why of sex as a biologic variable, and to provide examples of where their own research may take a very different turn or may provide them with a much much better clarity on their findings if they look specifically at sex differences. This is often an opportunity to provide examples, either through the research of individuals in the group, to show them what the possibilities might be if they begin to do their analysis stratified by sex and start to really understand what the possibilities are by including sex differences in their research and in their analyses. Secondly, I wanted to focus on individual mentorship. So all of our scholars have mentoring teams, and I believe that each mentor within that mentoring team can assist in including sex differences into the research. It may start with looking at the premise of the research and the background, looking for possible sex differences that are known, thinking about how to include both sexes in the method's design, and then how to design the analysis to address sex differences. I think there's a particular role to play for the biostatistical mentors in helping look at sex differences. I oftentimes, when bringing up the topic of sex as a biologic variable and asking junior faculty how they are accounting for sex as a biologic variable, the answer I frequently get is, well, we've adjusted for sex as a covariate. So I think if there's one thing we could do, it is train everyone to know that adjusting for sex as a covariate is really not analogous to looking at sex as a biologic variable and really understanding if there are sex differences in the analysis. So biostatistical mentors can be really helpful in understanding the role of both exploratory analyses where there may not be power, and it may be looking at the data without statistical analysis for possible signals that there may be a sex difference, as opposed to having a sex-specific hypothesis that requires confirmatory analysis and requires an adequate power calculation to ensure that that confirmatory analysis is powered to look for a result. I think it requires that our biostatistical mentors understand the various analytic methods that can be used to address sex differences. So how do we advance sex differences in research through mentorship? Well, I think this is going to involve mentor training. I think many of our mentors themselves are unclear on how to include sex as a biologic variable into research design and into analysis. So I think it requires that those of us that have mentor training programs consider adding this as a component in future mentor training programs. I think there's also a need to consider training study sections so that there's uniformity in how study sections apply the regulation and the rules around sex differences in biomedical research, so that our junior faculty can know what to expect when their grants are reviewed and can adequately prepare strong sex as biologic variable analysis plans to address that. I think there needs to be a specific focus from our biostatistical consultants and colleagues to put this focus into the biostatistical support that our junior faculty receive. So I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion today. I want to thank the Office of Research in Women's Health for 30 great years of support. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kedir Turi from Vanderbilt University. I'm a British scholar. Today I'll be sharing my perspective on adopting sex as biological variable in research. To outline my talk, I will briefly discuss my experience as British scholar, then highlight my approach in incorporating sex as biological variable in my research. Before joining British as scholar, my knowledge on why and how to incorporate sex as biological variable in research was very limited. I have learned a lot during the application process and also during my tenure as British scholar. As it was a requirement to have a research proposal to incorporate sex as biological variable and address sex differences in the pathogenesis of disease, the application process taught me a lot. I was fortunate enough to join a community of multidisciplinary British scholars who helped in the learning process. These include previous scholars serving as mentors for current ones. Our group met every week to peer review career development topics, manuscripts, and grant application for scholars. This process ensured that sex as biological variable is sufficiently incorporated and sex differences in the pathogenesis of disease were adequately considered. My area of investigation is asthma. So the remainder of the talk, I will provide examples on how I approach sex as biological variable in asthma research. Asthma is a chronic disease that affects about 339 million people around the world. In the US, that number is 25 million and is still increasing. There are recognized sex differences in asthma incidence and morbidity across this lifespan, which makes asthma a natural fit to study sex differences. This figure comes from CDC, and it shows the prevalence of asthma by sex and age groups. Blue bars are for male, and yellow ones are for female. As you can see from the figure, during childhood, asthma prevalence was higher among male children. And the prevalence switched around puberty. In adulthood, the prevalence of asthma was higher among women compared to men. Since the switch is around puberty, the usual suspects for sex difference in asthma are sex hormones. This prompts us and others to investigate relationship between sex hormones and risk of asthma to explain the sex differences. Using publicly available enhanced data, this study assessed the association between testosterone and odds of asthma stratified by age group and sex. As you can see from the figure, where the x-axis showed odds ratio and y-axis shows stratification groups. In male and female young age group, it is not significant, but increase in total testosterone seemed to increase the odds of asthma. In male and female adult group, increase in total testosterone seemed to increase the odds of asthma, but it's only significant in female adults. Even though testosterone is associated with odds of asthma, in adult female, we were not able to show that testosterone is responsible for sex differences in asthma prevalence. In fact, what we see from this estimation is the directionality of the estimate indicate that differential association between child group and adult group in the association. Asthma pathogenesis likely begin with in utero and early life exposures. In preschool child group, asthma is indistinguishable from viral wheeze. As you can see from the figure, in preschool group, wheeze prevalence is higher among male children. Childhood exposure to respiratory virus and consequent response of immune system are strongly associated with the development of asthma. Sex as biological variable affects both the function of immune system and wheeze. So we asked if sex difference immune response to respiratory viral infection could explain the sex differences in childhood wheeze in subsequent development of asthma. To study this, we used INSPIRE cohort, which is a birds cohort established in Middle Tennessee. Surveillance was conducted for respiratory infection during the first year of infant winter period. We conducted surveillance every 2 weeks when the children were sick with a respiratory infection, we took nasal wash samples, and we assayed those nasal wash samples for 53 cytokines, chemokines, and growth factors using multiplex assays. We also assayed using qPCR to detect RSV in the samples. We followed the children from 1 year to 4 years every year using questionnaire to assess wheeze frequency. We took the high dimensional data and analyzed by stratifying by sex. As you can see, we have 167 males in the sample and 131 female in the sample. We used a hybrid of supervised and unsupervised clustering approach to identify 3 distinct immune response clusters in both male and female. Without going into detail, the identified clusters were characterized as follows. Cluster 1 is dominated by type 2 immune response. And cluster 2 shows generally subdued immune response. And cluster 3 is dominated by type 1 immune response. The immune response clusters were generally similar between males and females, except for slight differences in the detail. Then we took the identified clusters and used generalized estimating equation to assess association between the identified clusters and recurrent wheeze from 1 year to 4 years. Recurrent wheeze here is defined as more than 2 wheezing episodes per year. The x-axis of the forest plot shows the adjusted odds ratio. Y-axis shows the clusters. The comparison group here is cluster 3. So compared to cluster 3, cluster 2 and cluster 1 are significantly associated with increased wheeze in female. A similar analysis in male, the directionality are similar with female, but not statistically significant. What we can conclude from this study is that even though generally prevalence of wheeze is higher in boys, type 2 dominated immune response to respiratory infection poses greater risk of childhood wheeze in girls. To summarize my talk, as British scholar, I have been fortunate enough to be mentored by an interdisciplinary community of investigators and be able to adopt sex as biological variable in my research. Asthma prevalence has known sexual dimorphism, which changes during childhood with a switch around puberty, and that makes it suitable to study sex differences. Understanding the underlying biological and environmental reason for sex differences in asthma incidence and morbidity is an ongoing effort. My approach to this problem includes using sex stratified high-dimensional molecular data to understand the upstream pathways driving disease during disease origin and explaining the heterogeneity of asthma. With this, I would like to acknowledge my funding sources, my prime mentor, Tina Hartert, who directs the Center for Asthma Research at Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt Bridge Leadership, PI Catherine Hertzman, and co-directors Digna Edwards and Amy Myers, and Bridge scholars at Vanderbilt who really provided great feedback both scientifically and career-wise. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and discussions.
Hi, everyone. It's Judy Regensteiner again from Colorado. And I am here to moderate the question and answer session. I want to thank my colleagues, Drs. Miller, Freund, and Turi, for their excellent. I thought they were spectacular so much. So I want to start with a question, and then the others can answer as well. I wanted to ask you, Virginia, what is the adoption of sex as a biological variable thinking at the Mayo Clinic? And I know that you're an innovative leader in curriculum development, as you are also in research going for the thinking around SABV.
Well, I have lost my visual, and I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is probably typical of many institutions, that we've seen some success with incorporating sex as a biological variable into some aspects of the curriculum. However, we have yet to be able to develop a standard curriculum into the medical school, which would incorporate these concepts into each of the individual blocks. Our biggest success has been with the CCATS program, the Clinical Science Translational Program, where we have actually series of lectures and workshops on these concepts. And we've also developed some course material within the epidemiology classes, or the coursework, that has incorporated the statistical analysis into population studies, as well as in the design of basic science studies. Our other major initiative has really been to educate researchers in terms of how to account for sex as a biological variable in their research grants. We started some workshops about 3 or 4 years ago, and those have been very successful in terms of individuals bringing their grants to the workshop, where we hammer these concepts out in person, look at the individual grants, and talk about how they can incorporate the concept, not only to fill out some questionnaire or block as how sex is important, but really to put it through the whole thought process of what must take place. And this has been, I guess, modeled at other places. We've had inquiries from at Cedars-Sinai, one of the other SCORE programs, and the Emory-Birch program has picked this up with a one-day workshop as well. So the individual efforts remain. Like I say, you have to keep at it. Otherwise, people lose attention to the next bright, shiny thing that happens down the road. Sex as a biological variable isn't a bright, shiny thing that'll go away. It is so basic. It is the bedrock of what we must work from.
I completely agree. Dr. Freund or Dr. Turi, I can't see you, but would you like to respond to that question as well, or shall I move on?
The one additional comment I might add is that you can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. The one additional comment I might add is I think there still has been some variability in how the NIH study sections are reviewing grants around their use of sex as a biologic variable. And I think that one of the possible ways of moving this forward at each institution is to assure that there is some standardization in grant reviews. I think there's nothing like knowing that your grants are going to be reviewed to motivate investigators and organizations to really have robust curriculum to train and robust review of grant submissions to ensure that they're accounting for this. So I think there are real needs, and I think there are real opportunities at our individual organizations to develop this curriculum. But I think it also can be moved further, maybe faster, by implementation of what we already have as guidelines in our NIH grants to include sex as a biologic variable where appropriate.
And if I can add to that a little, can I just add to that a little bit, Judy? You may be thinking this too. I mean, you brought up a good point. Accountability in terms of the study sections is one thing, but I think we also need to hold accountable individuals who get these supplements and who are getting NIH grants, that they actually report their data on the sex differences. And so that's a piece that I think can be strengthened moving forward, is accountability. And once that accountability moves forward in terms of getting the data into the literature, I think it's going to be easier to see the curriculum develop as a consequence of that, because there's going to be a natural sort of waterfall effect. If you have the information in the literature and it gets in, and it's always asked for, and it gets into clinical guidelines, it's going to have to go backwards into the medical curriculum for sure. And with questions on the exams in terms of licensing exams, that'll facilitate it. It's a little tougher on the basic science end, and that's why the accountability in the research grants and the publications is so important, because it's easy for that material to slip through the rocks, because slip through the cracks, because there's no ultimate outcome immediately in some of the basic science studies into patient-directed care.
I agree with both of you. We are working on curriculum at the University of Colorado's medicine, which we're going to give to our scholars are going to be required to take it. And it involves, they already do have a required curriculum. All our young scientists at the Center for Women's Health Research are taking curriculum that includes elements of training in academic skills, career development skills, and now we're going to certainly incorporate the new SABV primer that NIH just put out weeks ago. And I encourage everybody listening to look for this primer. It's amazing and really does help with describing how to incorporate sex as a biological variable into training, which is going to be critical to change the paradigm of thinking about one sex at a time, or male sex. So please look at that.
And I think that's critical too, in terms of educating the educators, that, you know, once we know certain fundamental things, and many individuals who may be facilitating a course are wringing their hands saying, where are the materials? So if we can now give them really good source materials, that things don't have to be created de novo each time a curriculum is developed, it'll facilitate these ideas. And that group of modules from NIH is wonderful, and really will help facilitate that. But we have to be sort of disseminators of that within our own institutions, because people aren't necessarily aware of it.
Dr. Freund, I want to direct this question to you first. You know, one of the things that I've thought about a lot is our junior, you know, our scholars, junior faculty, maybe early adopters of sex as a biological variable, but how do we work with older mentors? Not saying senior, that word is never popular, but saying people that are, you know, more established in the field, that haven't probably their whole career. How do we change their thinking, and how do we help them help younger?
So I think, yeah, so Judy, I think it's a great question about how do we move experienced investigators who may have not really developed their research to include sex as a biologic variable, especially if they're serving as the mentors for the next generation. I think there are a couple of things that I can think of that might be helpful. So first of all, mentors are not born, they are really trained. And I think there's really good literature now to suggest that we can train individuals to be good mentors. They don't have to sort of somehow be born with this innate ability to help other people do research. So there's really, we have found that in almost all the training grants that we submit through our organization, when we include specific mentor training as part of that training grant, it receives really good scores. Reviewers like the notion that we are actively training mentors. And so, you know, I think that for all Birch applications, for example, there should be a component about training mentors on how to mentor around sex as a biologic variable. And hopefully that could then be expanded to all training programs, because this is one of the key components of an NIH grant. And just the same way that we're training on rigor and reproducibility, and we're training on premise, this is one of the key components. So I think that developing that expectation, the training grants have mentoring programs or mentor training built into them, and that mentor training includes sex as a biologic variable, would be one way to very quickly move the dial forward for all of our programs.
That's great. It's This is such an exciting discussion that, all of it, that of course, I love this area. Dr. Miller, do you want to comment further on the idea of getting the more, we are more senior, I'll use that hated word, but we are passionate about mentoring and changing to look at SABV. But how do we get this out there? How do you see that happening at Mayo, for instance?
The more established investigators we have struggled with. And the best way to get to them, they're not going to come to a training program, okay? They're not going to sit down for an hour. We have tried to think about more creative ways, and I know at University of Kentucky, they start doing things around a lunchtime where they invite people, the mentors, to lunch and sort of talk about these concepts, and that might work. But now we're in this virtual environment, so good luck with that. I think one of the things that we can push is an indirect way. We have interaction with the scholars, and at Mayo, we're pretty scholar focused, and we're pretty hands-on with these scholars. And if we require them to do this material and require them to have their research directed towards a sex difference, that's going to trickle up maybe to their mentor. And we have reached several mentors that way, individuals who were very reluctant, who are now, and these are major senior people, are now writing major review articles looking at their own literature from a sex specific point of view. So I think there's not one approach that's going to take all. Somebody came to me in my last year or so of working and told me I had to go to a mentoring class. My eyes would roll. And I'm sure there are many other investigators in my position. Don't make me do one more thing, So I think we have to take a multi-pronged approach to how to get investigators at all levels engaged. And I think we have to think of their career stage, their age, and of course their gender in terms of what might work best for them.
That's a great discussion. Dr. Turi, I'm sorry, Karen.
I was just going to comment on your comment about whether you can get mentors to training. The one approach that we've used that actually has been successful is mentors really don't have a chance to talk about their experiences mentoring and both the pitfalls, what's worked well. And we've done a flipped classroom approach. So we've given them some materials to look at beforehand, and we really used the time together for discussion. And to my surprise, the reviews we've gotten when we've done that is that the sessions were too short. So that makes me think that the sessions were probably just the right length, because otherwise it'd be too long. So I wouldn't completely, I do understand the challenges of all the different competing demands on people's time. So I wouldn't completely give up on getting mentors together to want to talk about mentoring.
Yes, perhaps you could share some of those materials.
Yeah, and we've used many of the materials that are on the National Mentoring. I'm blanking on the NRMN's full name. I just can remember the acronym. But we've used the materials that are on that website on mentoring, and can provide those materials later in the discussion.
Great.
I think that points out one of the key things amongst Birch PIs and other people interested in women's health is the collaborative nature of the interactions. It's just wonderful, and we all learn very much from each other. Dr. Turi, I want to direct a question in your direction. NIH initiatives have greatly contributed to bringing sex as a biological variable thinking to the fore and have brought that thinking to research. What do you see as a next step or a next step?
I think that's a great question. And so especially for junior investigators like me who are just starting to navigate the NIH system and learning how NIH policy applies in terms of sex as biological variable is a great way of studying. But it's in this regard, it's a long way to go in the scientific arena that the approach to sex as variable is still not investigated enough. People like me can make a care out of it. and drive these in terms of methodological development, how to incorporate sex as biological variable into research and expanding in that area in bioinformatics and in using this high dimensional data to incorporate as sex biological variable, also developing biostatistical method that incorporates this concept into every research possible, that we see sex differences in the pathogenesis of disease.
That's great. What else would you like to add, Drs. Miller and Freund? We've talked already about how to increase and make sure that mentoring is available at all levels. We've talked about curriculum. What else do we need to do?
I think one of the
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I was just going to mention that there was one comment in the questions about the role of journals and making sure that holding our journal editors accountable to including sex differences in manuscripts and not just delegating the sex differences to the supplements, but really requiring if the NIH is requiring that we collect this data and report on this data, there's a need to really push at journal editors as well. Virginia, you were going to say something as well.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of sort of the concept of mentoring, our scholars have a mentoring team, but when we talk to our scholars, we want to encourage them to look at individuals beyond their mentoring team in terms of what they can learn from them. You don't have to have a formalized mentor in order to have an influence on your career. You can look at other investigators whom you admire or who are leaders in your particular scientific topic and emulate what they do. What is it about them that makes you admire them or want to be like them? And the kind of questions that you ask yourself in terms of what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, and where do I need to develop them? So we have developed kind of a checklist for individuals when they first come into the program in terms of certain characteristics of where they feel that they are on a scale. There's no grade for this. This is something that they can track, where they feel their weaknesses are in terms of manuscript writing or presentation or whatever. And every time we meet with them during the year of the program, we bring that checklist up and see and hold them accountable to what actually they're doing to proactively to correct what deficits they identify within themselves. So it's a dynamic process. It's not just the mentor doing something to the mentee. It's an active engagement, but it's only successful if the mentee wants to be mentored. We've had many mentees that you can, spend hours with them and then they go away and it's like, really, what has happened, So there's accountability on both sides. And I think, looking at other individuals other than your mentoring team sometimes can be very beneficial in terms of activity in your career. And even reaching out to individuals at other institutions. We've had several Berkeley scholars do that from when we used to go to meetings, and they end up being a co-mentor or whatever, or to go to their laboratory for additional training. So there's a proactive piece on this in terms of the mentee that is, I think, also critical.
What we're talking about, the acceptance of journals, is not a foregone conclusion. And in fact, it's still somewhat of an uphill battle. A lot of journals still do not disaggregate results in their report, make authors disaggregate their results. There are a lot of journals where you can still read an article where you don't know the sex of the animals being studied. There are many instances. So that issue is still very much an issue facing us. And the other issues are still there. What's exciting is now that there are beginning to be materials by which we can combat the lack of attention to sex differences. So things are changing.
I think, In terms of the journals, I like to always challenge the audience is that this is something they can fix because we all review papers. And I'll tell you what, if I get a paper, and I just got one today, that I still review papers if I think they're interesting and I can make an impact. And I can just read through the abstract. They tell me how many men and women they have, and then go off to give me the grouped results on drug-drug interactions, never segregating them by sex. That to me is unacceptable, and that's going to go back with major revision. So as a reviewer, you have quite a bit of influence in terms of what the ultimate publication will be. And we all can do that. That's not hard.
Grant review also allows you the opportunity to make sure that proper attention is paid to such issues. Well, we are running a little short on time, or we still have a few more minutes though. Any thoughts how about each person give their final thoughts to this discussion? Virginia?
Well, I just want to say that this has been an honor for me to participate in this workshop. If it hadn't have been for that grant I initially got under Bernadine Healy's leadership, I probably wouldn't be on this stage today. So really emphasize the fact of how providing resources, especially financial resources for this topic, goes a long way. And it's been a pleasure over my years to work with this area. I never thought I would be in it. And this is a good example of, how you take opportunities and really build a career. So thanks to everybody. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years. And I do wish the Office of Research on Women's Health continued success. I'm sure they will be.
Dr. Freund.
Yeah, thank you again to ORWH for this great, putting together this great symposium, during these challenging times. I know we would have all loved to have been together, but it's great to see our colleagues here on the screen and to learn about the work. And, I think that I'll just end by saying, I think Dr. Turi's presentation was really a great example and compilation of everything we talked about when you started by talking about working with your peer mentors who gave you a lot of guidance, starting with the submission process and talking about the various roles of the mentors within your interdisciplinary mentoring team. It was really a perfect example. And with asthma being so common, it is interesting that we've not had more work done to really understand the sex differences in asthma. So I want to congratulate you on your work and wish you good luck with your KO1.
Thank you very much.
Thank you also, Dr. Turi, because Birch scholars are really the workforce of the future. None of our work on women's health or health of women or sex differences is going to happen without, exciting young investigators like you. So thank you for the work you're pursuing. And I, for one, am really glad to have people so interested in this area. What would you like to say, Dr. Turi, as your final words?
Really, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really to give my perspective as Birch scholar. Thank you very much for OWH and for Birch also for bridging my, setting my career trajectory this way and transition me to a KO1, which really is very helpful. And also I'm very thankful to all Birch leadership, both at Vanderbilt and also at NIH levels, who really provided great advices all during these times. And I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to work on this area as much as possible in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate your participation. And I again thank NIH for putting on this wonderful panel. I found it so excellent, learned through the putting on of it. And I want to thank everyone. And again, thanks to Drs. Clayton, Begg, and Dutard for their hard work on it. And thanks, everybody, and have a good day.